Καλή σας μέρα. Κύριε Γενική Πρόξενε της Κύπρου, κύριε εκπρόσωποι της Ανωτάτης Διακλαδικής Σχολής Πολέμου, αγαπητοί και αγαπητές συνάδελφοι, αγαπητοί και αγαπητές φοιτητές και φοιτήτριες, σας καλωσορίζω στην πρώτη εκδήλωση στο πλαίσιο της σειράς διαλέξεων Thucydides και σε αυτή την πρώτη και αρχική εκδήλωση inaugural lecture, όπως λέγεται και στα αγγλικά, έχουμε την τιμή να φιλοξενούμε τον συνάδελφο αναπληρωτή καθηγητή από το Πανεπιστήμιο Εθνικής Άμυνας, National Defense University, Andrew R. Noble. Τον συνάδελφο τον είχα γνωρίσει από... I had first known him through his writings, because he has written an excellent article on Thucydides and the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, and he is among those who have insisted and put forward the role of Sparta's allies in the outbreak of war, and for this he deserved a quotation or a reference in the book that just has been, in my book, which has just been published. The second opportunity when I met him in person was a few months ago in September 2018 in the conference that was organized by our military school, the cadet school in Athens, τη Σχολή Ευελπίδων, where he was invited to participate in that ceremony for the 180, right? 90 years of the school. So there we have discussed, and the idea came that he should be visiting us while in vacation holidays in Cyprus, where Natalie, whom I welcome, is coming from. So Andrew, as a person, combines several traditions, which is the Hellenic, the Italian, and the American, right?
That covers it. Yeah.
That covers it. All right. Andrew holds a BA from Princeton University in history, a Master of Arts from the University of Oxford in international relations, and a PhD from the University of Oxford in modern history. Right now, and I'm reading his resume, Andrew serves as an associate professor of strategic studies at the National Defense University, as I mentioned earlier, in Washington, D.C. He is an expert in ancient and modern Mediterranean history, strategic studies, international relations, and military history. He has taught at Georgetown University and also lectured at the University of Cyprus, the United States Military Academy, the United States Naval Academy, and the National Arts Club in New York. He has also worked as a researcher at Harvard Business School and spent 3 years also in Cyprus. He is the author, besides his articles, he is the author of 2 books, One is of interest to us because it relates to the Cyprus financial crisis, and it also relates to a topic, a theoretical topic that we are very much interested in this department, specifically small states. And the title of that book is When Small States Crash. Do you remember it correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, small countries crash. Because it's not in my notes, it's by memory. He also wrote a novel concerning the fall of Constantinople. I just came to know that while I was reading his CV, and I haven't read it, so I'm looking forward. Today, as Andrew is the first speaker to lecture within this series, obviously the topic is on Thucydides, and the title he has chosen is Reimagining Thucydides: What International Relations First Scholar Tells Us About Contemporary International Politics. So Andrew is going to be doing two things: Thucydides, theoretical aspects and views on the one hand, and contemporary politics on the other, and how the two relate together. That's a task, and the floor, Professor Novo, is yours. Thank you.
I don't think this one is this a separate, turn this one off?
Should be on.
Is there a different button? I don't think it's off. I can speak a little loudly with people in the back.
Yeah, if you please.
Can you hear me if I speak?
Yeah, a bit louder if you please.
A little bit louder? All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Because people in Thucydides' time didn't have microphones anyway, so I remember when I was studying ancient history as an undergraduate, one of my professors in seminar said, "You're not allowed to type your answers. You're not allowed to type your assignments. I want you to write them out by hand." Of course, he said this in a very nice Irish accent, which I won't imitate because we have someone who naturally has a very nice Irish accent here. But he said, "Yes, write it out by hand, and that way you'll feel like you're back in the ancient world. It'll help you understand the world a bit better." So perhaps by being forced to project as if I was in the Athenian ecclesia, I will sort of get some inspiration from that. So thank you to everyone for showing up, being present for this discussion. To our military students, to our graduate students, colleagues, friends, and political dignitaries. It's a pleasure to be in Thessaloniki. Don't worry about the weather. I come from New York, so this is like spring for me. I'm used to it, and it's not a problem. And of course, I need to thank Professor Kuskouvelis for inviting me, for his hospitality, and for inviting me to give the inaugural lecture of the Thucydides Lectures series. This is the inaugural lecture, so it's a great honor to do that. Historians are often asked to apply historical events and the study of history to contemporary issues. Sometimes historians are uneasy about this, but it's an important task to do. Thucydides, of course, presents perhaps the best means to do this. He is, after all, rightly credited as the father of history. International relations, as a discipline, also lays claim to him as the first theorist of international politics. Few writers since Thucydides combine his interest in particular historical events and the broader themes of international politics as well as he does. He consciously wrote his book, as we all know, to be a possession for all time. And engaging with Thucydides is at once rewarding and demanding. His work is primarily a detailed narrative history, but it's interspersed with various philosophical observations, exercises in rhetoric, imitations of drama, and divergences into historical elucidation. Throughout his writing, he demonstrates not only knowledge of his subject, but the objective of uncovering root causes and a desire to explain behavior both for individuals and for states. Thucydides, of course, does these things very well. His exploration of the Peloponnesian War allows him to frame a number of important issues recurrent in the human experience and in the study of politics, both domestic and international. So what does Thucydides tell us about our own time? Or, as Professor Kouskouvelis has kindly framed the topic for today, what can Thucydides tell us about contemporary international politics? Well, like the Athenians setting off for Sicily, I fear I was more ambitious than I should have been in setting this objective for my expedition. After all, this is too expansive a realm for me to survey today, and hopefully my fate will not be similarly grim. Thucydides' book, though focused on a single conflict and sadly unfinished, still touches on too many subjects to address them all with anything approaching rigor and substance. That exercise would take at least a book. After all, Thucydides' work is concerned with policy and grand strategy, the origins of conflict, domestic politics, and the functioning of democracy, alliance dynamics, morality, and the corrosive impact of war on the values of civilized states. Instead of such an ambitious endeavor, I hope you will allow me to choose 3 areas from Thucydides which I believe hold particular utility in international relations today. The nature of power, how the distribution of power within international relations systems impact the decisions of war, peace, and deterrence, and the dynamics of alliances. These subjects hardly constitute an exhaustive list of Thucydides' contributions, but, as I hope to convince you, they do touch on critical issues in today's international politics. Thucydides' ideas and observations are profound in a way that often links one to the other, but I want to treat them distinctly, at least initially, in order to analyze them more coherently. This is particularly challenging since the interrelationship among them will be obvious as we proceed. So let's start with power. Like all students of international politics, Thucydides was an analyst of power. The nature and operation of power in his history demonstrates a sophisticated sense of this core international relations concept. From Thucydides, we have the infamous line that the powerful do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. But Thucydides challenges us to think beyond such terminology and consider what it means to be powerful. I'd like to use Thucydides' history to demonstrate that power is not simple to quantify, in spite of the pretensions of some international relations theory. I want us to consider that its metrics do not provide simple formula to determine victory in conflict or the effectiveness of deterrence. The actors in Thucydides' history experienced the reality that power is not always what it seems, and that measuring it is not an easy exercise. A reliance on the metrics that we use as a matter of course can be dangerous and misleading, particularly when it comes to policymaking. Power plays a role throughout the history. Thucydides tells us the story of Athens' rise to power. He famously explains the war in terms of the growth of Athenian power. Military practitioners learning lessons from the history often begin with the juxtaposition of Sparta, the land power, the elephant, with the sea power, Athens, the whale. This facile characterization has found modern echoes. Napoleon, for example, claimed that France was an elephant that would struggle to defeat the British whale. The United States has been described as the open maritime power reminiscent of Athens, while its foes, Russia and now China, have been identified as ponderous, earthbound mammals stomping around with authoritarian political systems and reliant on their tusks. Beyond these cliches, however, I want us to think about the ways in which Thucydides can help challenge us to think about the nature of power and how we measure it and how we see its uses. Power itself has many definitions and a rich literature devoted to its study. Let's take as a starting point one of the most straightforward and foundational. Power is the ability to get desired outcomes, to alter the behavior of another actor in the way we desire and counter to the desire of that actor. Getting another actor to do something they do not necessarily want to do is an inherent part of power. If my desired outcome is for my children to eat vegetables, I have to use some power to get them to eat vegetables. Because that's not necessarily what they want to eat. I don't demonstrate any power by getting them to eat chocolate, because they would do that perfectly well without any encouragement from me. From this basis, Thucydides gives us something to think about. The dominance of the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League on land is juxtaposed with the dominance of Athens and the Delian League at sea. But these are two different forms of power, which, while extremely potent in their respective domains, have very little direct impact on each other. Athenian triremes, while the most effective sea weapon system at the time, had very little direct impact on Spartan land forces. Spartan hoplites, superlative in the close combat of the ophismos, were not suited to countering the Athenians at sea. Returning to my children, my superior physical strength has very little impact on my power to get them to eat their vegetables. I could, I suppose, force feed them vegetables, and here I'm looking at my wife, but that carries far greater difficulties, right? I mean, imagine that, right? Which we don't need to get into at the moment, although I'm sure my wife could aptly explain why a parent's physical coercion is not an effective way to ensure a balanced diet for one's children, right? Thucydides' account of the initial phases of the war, where Athenian naval expeditions cut here and there at the Peloponnese to be countered by the overland thrusts of Sparta's army into Attica, shows us how difficult it is to measure the effectiveness of power when different kinds of power exist within different realms. At the onset of the war, which polis was the stronger? How can you compare Athenian triremes to Spartan hoplites? Power in the sense of military power is not easily fungible. It's not easily translated from one form to another. And here, we're only discussing and trying to compare some of the narrow aspects of military power. Trying to measure the broader power of Athens or Sparta in comparison to one another is extremely difficult. Thucydides shows us that leaders in both Athens and Sparta understood this. For this reason, they were reluctant to go to war. Exploring the nature of conflict, exploring the nature of power of the two states has explanatory power, not only their conduct during the war, but for that very choice to go to war in the first place. What do some of the traditional metrics tell us about Spartan and Athenian power? And how can we scratch the surface to get deeper in the subject? Well, we know that Athens had the largest population, the largest economy, and the largest navy in the Hellenic world. It had something on the order of 30,000 hoplites, a fleet of 300 ships, hundreds of talents in annual revenue, and thousands more as a reserve. Athenian silver mines and commerce produced the wealth to mint the dollar of the Hellenic world, the Athenian drachma, and it was also the driving force behind the creation of the lasting monuments that impress all of us when we visit Athens today. Sparta, on the other hand, had perhaps 5,000 hoplites at the outbreak of war in 431. In conjunction with its closest Peloponnesian clients, it had perhaps a fleet of 100 ships, Its agrarian economy produced no wealth comparable to Athens. Sparta had no currency, it minted no coins, and it used iron rods for large domestic transactions. It didn't even, as Thucydides so presciently wrote, build public monuments that would endure through the ages as evidence of his greatness. That's one of the most accurate statements about the future that Thucydides makes. He said, when you go to Athens, people, thousands of years from now, when they go to Athens, they'll see a place and they'll be so amazed by what they'll see. They'll think this was the greatest city ever in history. And their impression will be that it was much greater than it was. And he says, when people go to Sparta, they're not going to see anything in 2,000 years, and they're going to say, wow, they're never going to believe that these people were really powerful when I was alive. So perhaps those of you who've been to Sparta or had the same experience. By themselves, such numbers and elements are still a simplistic perspective on Athenian and Spartan power. From Thucydides, we understand that numbers alone tell only part of the story. For example, Sparta's political and economic institutions, its system, fashioned peerless warriors, but it hamstrung them at the same time. The subjugation of the citizens of neighboring Messenia and their subjugation as helots defined Sparta's domestic order. This order produced citizens who didn't actually own land. They were given public land by the state. They had publicly owned slaves, the helots, and their sole occupation could be training for and fighting wars. But this order came at a cost. It meant that Spartans' citizens lived in perennial fear of domestic unrest. Xenophon, who famously continued where Thucydides left off, graphically recorded this hostility when he wrote that the helots would welcome the chance to eat every Spartan raw. Now, appetites for Spartan sashimi aside, vulnerability to the helots underpinned Sparta's reality. This had a real impact on Spartan foreign policy. Their armies faced real constraints on how far from home they could be deployed and for how long they could stay on campaign, for fear of a helot revolt. This then was a major constraint on Sparta's all-powerful army, and one not really captured by simply looking at the numbers. The precious nature of her citizen soldiers and the connection between the city's power and their reputation also meant that Sparta exposed herself to devastating consequences when she fielded her full army and sent it into battle. In such cases, as at the Battle of Mantinea in 418, where 4,500 Spartans fought, Thucydides tells us, through the voice of Alcibiades, that the Spartans risked everything upon the issue of a single day. And here I look at our military colleagues and ask them, based on training of military officers today, it's probably not encouraged to risk the entire strength of your country on the issue of a single day, right? This is not, it's like, well, what do we do? Well, let's go out with everything we have. We'll flip a coin. If we win, great. If we lose, well, everything will be devastated, but that's okay, right? So this was what Sparta confronted. That if they went out with everything they had, the fragility of the system was such that they could lose everything in a single day. And that's exactly what happened half a century later. At the Battle of Leuctra, the defeat of Sparta's main army in a single battle by Thebes effectively ended Spartan hegemony over the Peloponnese. And this event demonstrates that although Sparta's army was an enormous source of power, this power was quite brittle. To put and keep large forces in the field, Sparta needed the support of allies. The most prominent among these at the time of Thucydides were Corinth and Thebes. These alliances were an enormous source of Spartan strength. They were essential to Spartan power projection. Corinth, for example, had a population somewhere in the region of 90,000 citizens, about a third of that of Athens. This would have given its army a theoretical strength of around 10,000 hoplites. We know Corinth also boasted the second largest fleet in the Hellenic world and had at least half as many ships as Athens. Thucydides also adds the fact that it was Corinthian craftsmen who built the first modern galleys, which would suggest a certain degree of technical competence in Corinthian arms production. Corinth was also a major economic power, rivaling Athens as a trading center and pottery producer, Archaeologists love to look at these metrics. You know, how much Athenian pottery do we have in a site versus how much Corinthian pottery do we have in a site? You see the one going down, the other going up, and so archaeologists and ancient historians interpret trade wars and changes in trade dynamics. So this is interesting stuff to study for those of you who look at those things. Corinth was also a major economic power. It was famous for its luxuries. That's why if you see the three classical orders of columns, you have the Doric, right? That's Spartan, very simple, straightforward, no messing about, right? The Ionian, you have the Ionic one that's sort of in between. It's nice, but it's still sort of normal. And the Corinthian one is very elaborate, right? It's very elaborate because Corinth was a place of great wealth. It was famous for its luxuries. It was actually famous on the naughty side too, because it was famous for a temple of Aphrodite, which employed thousands of prostitutes, which was a major source of revenue for the city. It was also popular with foreign visiting businessmen, but we'll leave that aside. Corinth's independent capabilities and its wide-ranging strength complicated its relationship with Sparta. We will explore these complexities further when we analyze alliances, but for now, we see that Sparta's power, in part, stemmed from its leadership of the Peloponnesian League. This systemic domination, reinforced by institutions, like the Congress of the Peloponnesian League, allowed it to project power far beyond its own limitations. But this also meant that Sparta's power was not entirely Sparta's to command. In making foreign policy decisions about war, the conduct of war and peace, Sparta was tied to the interests of its partners. Thucydides' account engages with the complexities inherent in these power relationships and challenges us to consider how they shaped events. Athens, in spite of the impressive numbers I quoted above, also had vulnerabilities. Thucydides' account makes this clear. Its very size actually created challenges and vulnerabilities. 300,000 Athenians could not be fed from its territories in Attica alone. As Thucydides tells us, the soil in Attica was poor, and this, he notes, was the reason Athens sent out colonists to Ionia and became the first of the Greeks to take to the sea. In practice, this also meant a reliance on imported food, especially imported corn. Athens built its port, the Piraeus, and the long walls connecting Athens and the Piraeus, partially in order to ensure its supply of food. It's no accident that repeated and significant Athenian military expeditions went to Egypt, Sicily, and the Black Sea, regions well known in antiquity for their corn production. At the outbreak of the war, it was Pericles' decision to bring even more people into the already crowded city of Athens, which resulted in the devastating spread of the plague. Here, as a small aside, we can note another contribution of Thucydides, the role of chance in international affairs. Most students of international relations and conflict who have real experience in operations, Thucydides, Machiavelli, Clausewitz, all emphasize the significant role chance plays in all human affairs, particularly in military affairs. So if we recognize the limitations of traditional metrics of power used in international relations, as well as dig a little deeper in considering both the foundations of power and the potential vulnerabilities that come with them, how can we apply such principles to contemporary international politics? In contemporary international politics, for example, two of the defining features are the predominance of the United States and the rise of China. But how do we measure power for the great powers of today? Shall we sort them out according to GDP, the number of aircraft carriers, fifth-generation fighter planes, or soldiers under arms? What about nuclear weapons? Frequently, these are the metrics used, often with admitted reluctance, by scholars of international relations, particularly those within the realist tradition. Some of them, such as William Wolfworth, use these metrics to make a case for a deep and enduring global hegemony of the United States. But taking our cue from Thucydides, we must question the utility of this exercise. If GDP, state-of-the-art aircraft, and the number of soldiers determined victory, the United States would have triumphed in Afghanistan and Iraq a long time ago. For that matter, wouldn't the United States have also won the war in Vietnam? How should we see American power? Military power is certainly a major component of that equation, but what impact does it have on outcomes when the threat is not an overtly military one? or when the threat is what we call asymmetrical. Did American power deter Russia's seizure of Crimea? Has it pushed Russia 1 inch in the direction of abandoning Crimea or its ongoing operations in eastern Ukraine? Can any of America's nuclear weapons defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan? Our aircraft carriers don't deter China from building islands along its 9-dash line in the Pacific. And as other scholars of international relations, Joseph Nye, for example, have pointed out, military power means nothing in confronting non-military threats. Our 5th-generation stealth aircraft can't combat climate change. Our battle tanks don't address the flow of illegal immigrants. Our airborne capabilities don't rectify trade deficits. How can we assess power in a more comprehensive and accurate way in today's world? First, I think we need to understand the vulnerabilities of each actor. As Thucydides tells us, the surest method of harming an enemy is to find out what he fears most, and to choose this means of attacking him, since everyone naturally knows best his own weak points and fears accordingly. Athens understood that it was vulnerable to food shortages, so it built the Piraeus, the long walls, and the most powerful fleet in the Hellenic world. Sparta recognized its vulnerability vis-a-vis the Helots. To maintain control, strong and intelligent Helots were frequently murdered. So imagine, we all try to stay in shape, right? We want to be good. We want to go to the gym. The military guys all have, fitness tests they have to pass, and if you don't pass your fitness test, you get in trouble. It was the opposite if you were a Helot. If you went to the, so that helps me. Like, I don't like to go to the gym, so a little bit of laziness helps you. If you were a little overweight as a Helot, if you were a little stupid, this was good. If you were smart, you started asking intelligent questions, you went to the gym, you were really fit, you disappear. So, this is not how graduate students should be, though. You should ask, difficult questions and be attentive. But to maintain control, strong and intelligent Helots were frequently murdered. All were subject to regular, savage physical punishment, whether they had done anything wrong or not. So wake up, hi, it's the 13th day of the month. It's time for your beating. Why? I didn't do anything. Doesn't matter. We beat you. Okay, now go off. Have a nice day. We'll see you next month. Helots were humiliated through public drunkenness. You take the Helots, make them drink, then have them run around, and you take your children and say, see what an idiot people look like when they're drunk? And, oh, yes, I see. I won't drink, Daddy. Sure, yeah, I don't believe you, but fine. It was these vulnerabilities that each side tried to exploit in the other. As Thucydides explains, it was the Spartan decision to fortify the small town of Decalia at the urging of Alcibiades that proved disastrous for Athens. At one stroke, it deprived the Athenians of silver revenues from the mines of Laurium. It deprived it from other revenue sources from its allies, the tribute from its allies. It deprived it of prestige, and it deprived it of food supplies. Athens became entirely dependent on resupply and receiving goods from the sea. As Thucydides explains, the occupation of Decalia resulted in so much devastation of property and loss of manpower for the Athenians that it was one of the chief reasons for the decline of Athenian power. The Athenians suffered great losses. They were deprived of the whole of their country. More than 20,000 slaves, the majority of whom were skilled workmen, deserted, and all the sheep and farm animals were lost. Exploiting the vulnerability of the enemy is the essence of strategy. What do vulnerabilities look like today? Some nations are particularly vulnerable to climate change. Others have endemic food shortages, political divisions, or acute economic challenges. Recently, for example, Russia has used information campaigns to exacerbate and even manufacture political divisions within Western democracies. Open media, polarized populations, divisive political campaigning, media driven by ratings, news platforms driven by clicks and likes, have created massive vulnerabilities in the West. These are being exploited because our superior wealth and military power are not, and sometimes cannot, be directed to fighting in these realms. On the global side, integrated economy also heightens the power of money. This creates different vulnerabilities. China's power owes a great deal to its wealth, which it turns to influence and power. Chinese investment in the American movie industry, for example, ensures that China cannot be portrayed as the villain in Hollywood films. Right? How many of you have seen a movie where China is the bad guy recently? And this is no accident. There was actually a little bit of a, this became a bit of a news story in the United States. For those of you who are a little bit older, there was a movie in the 80s called Red Storm Rising. Has anyone ever seen the movie Red Storm Rising? Some military guys are nodding. They won't admit it, or they'll admit it in private. I don't know if it was a particularly good movie, but the plot of the movie was that the Soviet Union invades the Western United States, tries to take over the United States, and a bunch of, good, strong frontiersmen, kind of American independent people start a guerrilla war against the Soviets and drive them out, right? I mean, of course, this was during the guerrilla war in Afghanistan anyway, so it was kind of like, anyway, strange parallelism. But in any case, the Soviet Union was the bad guy, right? It was the Cold War. Some Hollywood director had the bright idea that they were going to remake this movie. For those of you who follow the movie industry, this is very common, right? This is one of the criticisms of Hollywood today, that it's all reboots and remakes. If people are nodding tonight, right? So, redos and remakes, they want to remake this movie, and they said, okay, what are you going to do? We can't use the Soviet Union, they're gone. Okay, well, who are we going to use? We'll use China. They got a phone call, apparently, and they said, no, you cannot use China. So they did remake the movie, and who's the bad guy? Does anyone know? North Korea is the bad guy. Which, to be honest, I mean, I have to say, actually, none of the views I'm presenting here reflect the opinions of the United States government. These are my personal views only, and in no way reflect the official position of the United States government. It seems slightly ridiculous to me that North Korea would be able to launch an invasion of the United States, but in the film, this is how it happened, right? It's North Korea is the enemy, is not the United States. It's not China. And there's a reason for that. There is massive Chinese money devoted not only to preventing China from being portrayed as the bad guy, but in order to have China actively portrayed in a positive light in American media, in American Hollywood. In Cyprus, for example, a single Russian company controls 50% of hotel bookings in the most popular coastal tourist towns. A single Russian company controls 50% of the beds, right? We all know about Russian gas in Germany. It accounts for about 50% of Germany's gas. Of course, Germany's gas makes up about 20% of its energy needs, so it's not an insignificant number. Such realities can translate into tangible political outcomes. Consider the scandal in Germany surrounding the attitudes of the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. Right? This is a guy who in 2007 supported Russia in its dispute with Estonia. Remember in 2007, the Estonians wanted to take down the statue of a Soviet soldier. It was in the town square in the capital of Estonia, and the Estonians said, look, the Russians put this statue of a giant Soviet soldier, but the Soviets invaded us in 1940. Stalin shot a few thousand of our intelligentsia. Tens of thousands of people got deported to Siberia. This guy, he's not really a liberator to us. He's kind of a foreign occupier who we don't like. You know, my uncle Boris, for example, died in Siberia because of this guy. Russia said, oh, this is horrible, these neo-fascists, they want to remove the statue of the noble Russian who saved them from Nazis. And Gerhard Schroeder sided with Russia on this issue. In 2008, he blamed Georgia for the war with Russia and Georgia, right? He said, oh, the president of Georgia, Saakashvili, he's crazy, this is provoked, this was, America wanted this war, America wanted this, this is, the Georgian people, they're, victims of this crazy guy, Russia is absolutely right for invading Georgia. In 2014, he said nothing, crickets about, Russian aggression in Crimea and Ukraine, crickets. This is the same Gerhard Schroeder who just happens to be on the board of directors of Nord Stream and Rosneft, where he earns hundreds of thousands of euros a year for part-time work on the boards of these companies. As a Georgian friend of mine put it, if Russia can buy the #1 politician of Europe's #1 economy, what hope does Georgia have? That's a Georgian friend of mine. This sort of power, the power of influence, of interconnected economies, energy supplies, corporate interests, individual decision makers, and non-state actors makes defining states' capabilities in the international system more challenging than ever before. Recognizing the difficulties in measuring power connects to characterizing the international system according to some sort of polarity. As with the whale-elephant paradigm I mentioned earlier, Athens and Sparta are often characterized as the two superpowers of a bipolar Hellenic system. Like power, bipolarity has its own literature, replete with competing definitions, but without delving into this, I'd encourage everyone to think about why such a simplification is problematic, and why considering polarity within today's world is an extremely challenging exercise. Again, to go back to Joseph Nye, he says, well, one way to look at it is think about the world as like a three-tiered chessboard. You have the military realm, and there you could say the world is unipolar because you have America and then you have everybody else. But think of the second chessboard as economics. Is the world really unipolar economically? Of course not, right? I mean, the European Union is the world's largest economy by itself. The United States is a little bit smaller than the European Union. China is almost as big as the United States. In the realm of economics, you have non-state actors, which are enormous, right? I mean, companies like Google or Apple or Samsung or Siemens, Volkswagen, these companies are enormous. Exxon, all the energy companies, they can push around small countries and get what they want sometimes for oil and gas extraction. So think about it on that chessboard, it's a multipolar world. And then he says, think about all the challenges which are inherently transnational. Migration, climate, terrorism. It's almost useless to talk about polarity in that sense because the problems are transnational by their nature, no individual nation can solve them, regardless of how powerful they are. Because the problem, by its nature, being transnational, is beyond their scope. So how do we measure power in today's world? How do these metrics allow us to understand the capabilities of states? Can they predict the efficacy of deterrence or the outcome of conflict? And how do we fit them into measuring the balance of power? As I said, Thucydides' world is often interpreted as a bipolar one, fixated on the twin pillars of Sparta and Athens. And I think this is a misleading simplification because it subverts rather than confirms Thucydides' own presentation of power and its dynamics. We mentioned the importance of Corinth, which could be considered another power in this. As Thucydides' history demonstrates, Syracuse commanded enough resources to defeat Athens in its Sicilian expedition. And of course we have Persia as well, which was a major power with economic and material resources greater than Sparta and Athens combined. And Sparta and Athens themselves were in fact the leaders of two very different alliance blocs. In this capacity, a great deal of their power was not theirs, properly speaking, but belonged to their allies and partners. Only the willing collaboration and cooperation of these allies allowed Athens or Sparta to put that power into action. And these allies could and did change sides, and these allies could and did act based on their own interests. Now we know Athens' Delian League was a grouping of between 150 and 300 polises from across the Hellenic world. Athens was the undisputed hegemon of this alliance. It was the richest, it was the most populous. In the military sphere, it contributed the most men and the most ships. After a certain time, most of the other states just contributed money instead of contributing ships, which increased the Athenian treasury, the Athenian fleet, and Athenian dominance. Sparta's Peloponnesian League was different in its construction. It linked several dozen different polises to Sparta through bilateral agreements. And Sparta's allies ranged from insignificant Peloponnesian city-states to cities like Corinth and Thebes that were major powers in their own right. As independent actors, these allies contributed not only to the conduct of the war, but to its origins. As significant as any contribution in the history, Thucydides gives us insights about the origins of conflict, which are still meaningful today. As with the application of much of his work in international relations, there's a tendency toward oversimplification and decontextualization on this issue. And this trend is most obvious in seeking to explain the causes of war through bumper stickers like the Thucydides trap, which has recently been peddled through academic and policy worlds in Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. And here I'm going to speak particularly to our young scholars in the audience. This is a little technical secret of the academic trade. Whenever you have a title for a book or a paper, and you're not entirely confident with it, and you think, how can I make this sound better? Do what Graham Allison did. Put a question mark at the end. It will make you seem much more sophisticated. Because if you say, destined for war, declarative, serious, I know this is going to happen, it just seems like you're making a statement. But if you say, destined for war, question mark, Now you've really planted something to think about for the audience, and now all of your readers are going to say, ah, yes, yes, yes. This young student from the University of Macedonia, yes, they really know what they're talking about. This is a very profound question they've posed for me. So, this is a little secret. Allison's distillation of Thucydides is the simple message of power transition theory. That when a rising power challenges the order of an established power, we should watch out for conflict. Right? He actually says in his book, warning light should go off. It's as if you're the captain of the Titanic and you've just been told that there are icebergs. Warning lights, warning sirens should sound. Watch out, collision ahead, right? Systemic factors are at work that make conflict likely, and avoiding conflict will take enormous effort. Of course, what Allison is offering us is a simplification. And as Professor Kuskubelius' own work demonstrates, Thucydides pays a great deal of attention to the agency and decision-making of individual leaders. His account elucidates the importance of personalities and domestic politics over systemic factors, and is philosophically opposed to determinism. And here we can link our previous discussion on the nature of power to this fundamental argument of Thucydides, that the war was caused by the growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. What aspects of Athenian power were growing, and why would this cause fear in Sparta? These seem to be, more profound questions that we should be asking. What do these dynamics tell us about competition between two great powers in the contemporary world? Well, we can look at the metrics of power, Thucydides' own account, and other available evidence to try and unpack this pregnant sentence. The historical record shows us that Athens was not growing territorially in this period. It hadn't added new colonies or new conquests. It hadn't begun new building programs for its fleet. It hadn't achieved any technological breakthrough. It hadn't recruited or trained new army units. It hadn't extended its citizenship and therefore broadened its space for conscription. So where was Athenian power growing? The single growth of Athenian power was its alliance with the island of Corcyra, Kerkyra. This by itself might not have frightened Sparta, right? With its hoplites and its helots, why would Sparta fear an island offering 120 ships in alliance to Athens? So what were the roots of Sparta's fear? What was at issue that Athens was challenging the commercial and political interests of Sparta's ally, Corinth? Corinth's fear of Athenian expansion in its backyard led to pressure on Sparta for war. Thucydides makes this point clearly, writing in Book 1 that finally the point was reached when Athenian strength attained a peak, plain for all to see, and the Athenians began to encroach upon Sparta's allies. The Athenians began to encroach on Sparta's allies. It was at this point that Sparta felt the position to be no longer tolerable and decided, by starting this present war, to employ all her energies in attacking and, if possible, destroying the power of Athens. What Thucydides does not tell us, or at least tells us indirectly, is that Sparta was not acting entirely out of selfless obligation to its allies or its treaty commitments. Its leaders realized that defections from its Peloponnesian League would leave it dangerously exposed, because the League and its member states were integral parts of Spartan power. Sparta's fear was not Athenian commercial expansion or the growing power of Athens' fleet. It was the fear that its position as hegemon of the Peloponnesian League would not be sustainable in the face of Corinthian defection. Sparta's dominant position in the Peloponnese was contingent on the support of Corinth. Without Corinth, Sparta would be hard-pressed to maintain its dominance, and so chose war with Athens rather than lose Corinth as an ally. The dynamics of alliances is another critical contribution of Thucydides, one which can resonate in our world today. Alliances in the Hellenic world were fluid, and changes in alignments were often the inflection point for conflict. Thucydides helps explain conflict in terms of alliance policies. Time and again in the history, we see that shifts in alliances led to conflict. We have seen how the shift of Corcyra from the position of neutral to Athenian ally prompted the ire of Corinth and Corinthian entreaties to Sparta to attack Athens. The 50 years peace of 421, also called the Peace of Nicias, was eroded almost immediately because of Corinthian opposition. Corinth, still feeling insecure vis-a-vis Athens in 421, opposed Sparta's plan for peace, Along with Thebes, it refused to sign the peace treaty. It first adopted neutrality, apparently withdrawing from the Peloponnesian League, and then spectacularly negotiated a treaty with Athens against Sparta, convinced that it could claim the dominance of the Peloponnese for itself. Corinthian forces were then conveniently absent from the decisive action at the Battle of Mantinea, but a campaign to topple Sparta only became feasible when the neutral Argives agreed to the alliance and joined forces with Athens. Once war resumed, Corinth returned to its traditional opposition to Athens and alliance with Sparta, and this lasted until the defeat of Athens. In the aftermath of Athens' surrender, new alliances formed again. This is, of course, after Thucydides' account, right? He didn't write about this particular part. But after the surrender of Athens, only 9 years after its defeat, Athens broke with Sparta, allied with Corinth and Argos and Thebes, and another war, the Corinthian War, raged for another 8 years. That story is complicated and illustrative in its own right, but it's also a story told by historians other than Thucydides. And for today's international politics, the lessons are equally important. Alliances are not immutable. Their changing dynamics are often the cause of instability. The realignment of states with the international system is fraught and can easily spark conflict. Institutions like the Peloponnesian League can be a source of strength and a way for countries to exercise and enhance their power by cooperating with states that share their objectives and values. In a rare moment where he echoes the sentiments of liberalism, Thucydides writes that there can never be a firm friendship between men or a real community between different states unless there is a conviction of honesty on both sides and a certain like-mindedness in other respects. For if people think differently, they will act divergently. Where do we see such challenges manifesting themselves today? In Europe, aspirations for continued expansion of the European Union and NATO continue. Accession talks for Georgia to NATO and closer relations between the EU and Ukraine had bloody implications in 2008 and 2014. Both of these conflicts remain unresolved. How should the European Union and the United States handle the expansion or integration of such institutions, and what is at stake in their choices? What about the Pacific? Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea are all treaty allies of the United States. There are two possible scenarios, though, in the region which could prompt conflict. In one, America's absence compels these countries to take a tougher line against China. Their regional balancing of Chinese power may not become violent, right? It may not be war, but it could certainly involve conflict in other forms. As Thucydides tells us, superior powers are both envied and feared. If China is envied and feared by other nations in the Pacific, these other nations might work to counter it. In another scenario, one of these American allies might feel that the United States is no longer the optimal partner. If South Korea or the Philippines become convinced that China made a more attractive ally and abandoned the United States, there would be significant fallout, possibly leading to violent conflict. As in Thucydides' time, alliances are a source of both stability and vulnerability. Allies with less capacity may be more hawkish or may feel greater threat, so the dominant power must debate whether it should follow what the smaller partner wants it to do. Chain ganging can be a costly policy, but when you're dependent on your allies for preeminence, how can you avoid chain ganging? Alliances made in one era to deal with one particular set of threats may not be suited to another. In Thucydides' time, the Peloponnesian League and the Delian League were old creations, designed to serve the needs of previous eras, when the greatest threat came from Persia. Much of our own time is shaped by institutions that were created in response to the Second World War and to the Cold War, like the United Nations Security Council, the Bretton Woods system, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and NATO. How relevant are such organizations in engaging with the challenges of today's world? Or how do they need to update and remodel themselves and rethink of themselves in order to deal with the challenges of today? Politicians within Europe and the United States question the utility of NATO in the post-Soviet age. They might also doubt its utility if American power begins to wane. Right? We hear this theme from the American perspective. There are voices questioning how and why a weaker America with more debt can provide security to rich Europeans who are already secure. From a European perspective, why would European security want to be tied to an unreliable or weakening America whose best days are behind it? As Thucydides tells us, in such situations, no one can be blamed for looking after his own safety in his own way. Now, my own view is that European and American security is best served through cooperation, and in our own uncertain contemporary international politics, we need to maintain the institutions and stability which allow us to prosper. And so we may hope that Thucydides remains eternally relevant and eternally studied. As long as humans control their own destiny in international affairs, his work will remain a possession for all time. So thank you very much for listening to my speech, and I look forward to your questions. Come to the microphone.
Thank you, Professor No, for your speech. As you noticed, he spoke of Thucydides and his views on power, the cities or the actors' vulnerabilities, as well as alliances. And he related those topics of power, power's fungibility, and the vulnerabilities of the actors, and alliances, cohesion, purpose of the alliance with today's issues. So thank you, Professor Novo, for your presentation, for your speech, and the floor is yours. Questions, please. I'll start with a student.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for your very inspiring speech. I would like to draw on your last point and ask, especially in relation to what you said about not being able to force something onto someone, like forcing your children to eat vegetables through force feeding them. How do you think burden sharing could work in NATO, and is whining about it and forcing allies to meet a certain goal the way to do it?
So, burden sharing in NATO is it's part of the foundational aspect of the treaty. I mean, the 2% is in the structure of the treaty itself. I think, in some ways, though, as we all know, that the number is arbitrary, right? Because if I spend 2% of my GDP on defense, but I buy things which are completely useless for NATO, I'm not helping NATO, right? I can spend less than 2% and actually buy things that NATO finds useful and use those too. And that's, I think, where the issue is. I think that there needs to be a much clearer and coordinated sense among NATO nations about what they are trying to accomplish. Why does this alliance exist? What are its purposes? What are the strategic needs and concerns of the member states, and how the resources of NATO can best be deployed to achieve those ends. There are also difficulties in terms of burden sharing with let's say the other side of the argument, right? The United States and Europe both have a degree of wanting to have their cake and eat it when it comes to NATO issues. I'll give you the American example and the European example. The United States, not just President Trump, he just does it in the most blunt and I won't use other adjectives way of expressing it, but many American presidents have said, look, we have a 2% treaty obligation, other states are not fulfilling it. The American double issue on this is America likes being the dominant voice in NATO. And the more America contributes to NATO, the more dominant that voice is. If America encourages and pushes European nations spend more, do more, be more, European nations are not going to feel as dependent on the United States, and America will lose its ability to direct NATO in its ways. And the European other side of the coin is similar, right? I mean, on the one hand you say, well, we don't want to spend this money because we can put this money to better use, let America spend it. Okay, but then if America spends it, America is going to be there in European countries, with bases in European countries, And sometimes Europeans say, well, we don't want that. We'd like to have our own control of these issues. American basing is another very political issue. With Germany this week, this was a political issue after the Iraq War. America said, fine, you don't want us here, you're secure, we're leaving Germany. And the local parts of the federal government in Germany, those different regions, said, don't take 30,000 American soldiers away from us, that's huge revenue for our region, right? So there's this difficulty in those issues. But I think the big question is, what is the purpose of this alliance? What are the strategic challenges that every country faces? And how can we best direct resources to dealing with that? And these are very difficult questions because since NATO has grown so big and is so diverse in its membership, the nations have very different concerns. So Portugal's concern is not the same as Estonia's concern. And the challenge that NATO has is how can we present to the world a unified front where we acknowledge that if Estonia is attacked, Portuguese soldiers will come to protect Estonia. I think the issue is that it's not really a question of Portuguese soldiers. I think that NATO needs effective means to deter different kinds of aggression. And I think that it also needs an awareness of the multiplicity and modernity of the threats facing it. And as a result, it needs different resources just from tank brigades and airplanes to meet those challenges.
For the record, she's an undergraduate student, and I'll give now the question to Professor Bell.
Thank you very much for the talk, Professor. My question somehow relates to what my student asked, and I think that is partly answered according to your last comments and regards alliances. And it has been much discussion recently as regards Thucydides' contribution to Chinese-US relations. However, it's not clear to us what's the current perspective of the American administration as regards alliances. Precisely because there is an effort towards the Pacific to form something similar to what was the case in the European institutional architecture as regards alliances. It's not very successful. On the other hand, it's very kind of uncertain as regards the commitment, the US commitment as regards alliances in other terrains, the European and of course in other regions. What's your perspective? What do you think is what you read as regards the current American commitment to alliances in general? Thank you.
So I would say that the institutional commitment in the United States to alliances is extremely strong. And by institutional, when we talk about different layers of decision making, or the Graham Allison model of bureaucracies in action and different groups, I mean the institutional commitment to alliances is a bedrock of American policy, and that is not going to change. So commitments on the multilateral level with organizations like NATO, with the European Union, and bilaterally with alliances in the Pacific, because this is a key difference between the two regions, is that in Europe, America's alliances are multilateral, part of the institution, part of NATO, and in the Pacific, they're all bilateral with the countries that I mentioned. So on the institutional level, the perspective is very strong on alliances. The challenge that the United States has with regard in Europe is that the different countries of Europe have different attitudes, and the United States has its own attitude about what constitutes the threat. I'll give you an example. In my capacity at my job at work, we very often have foreign dignitaries visiting, and we engage with them. We had the chief of the army, of the Hellenic army, come, and I got a brief from the Pentagon, which they sent to me as let's say, the expert on the region, about what the general would like to speak about with us. And I read it, and the chancellor of my college said, is it good? Is it right? Should we go with this? And I said, no, it's completely wrong. Because they said Greece's concerns are Al-Qaeda, terrorism, ISIS, Russia. And I crossed these things out and I said, no, these are not Greece's concerns. Greece's concerns are 1, migration, 2, Turkey, 3, territorial, territorial, just territorial disputes, 4, Cyprus. And the general came and he spoke and he said 1, 2, 3, 4 from my list. He didn't say 1, 2, 3, 4 from the list that the Pentagon sent. So there's this disconnect of what we're concerned about and what our partners are concerned about. In the Cold War, it was easy. Everyone was concerned with the Soviet Union, and even then there were differences with how people felt the degree of the threat and the nature of the threat. I think this is NATO's big challenge now: is how does it orient itself? How does it consider itself so that everyone is reading from the same sheet of music? And one of the best